Everyone, this is going to be 15.4 Cold War Fears at Home. We're going to start with a quote from Edward R. Murrow, who was one of the people who stood up to Joe McCarthy during the Red Scare number two, who said, "We cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home." He said this on his TV show called See It Now. Our objectives: we're going to describe the effects of Truman and the House Un-American Activities Committee trying to fight communism at home. We're going to explain how domestic spy cases intensified fears of communist influence within the U.S. government. And we're going to analyze the rise and fall of Joe McCarthy and methods of McCarthyism. So let's look at Cold War tensions at home first. The fear of communism abroad led to a great fear of it at home as well. Many people believed that communists were out to destroy our way of life and that they were here already. That was the big fear. Not just like out in the open communists like members of the Communist Party, but secret communists in your government, in the army, in your backyard. They're everywhere. They've influenced and infiltrated every part of our lives. This led to a huge paranoia against communism called the Red Scare. This is the second one we've had. This one was much worse. And Hollywood did not help with things like "I married a communist." Anyway, now there were some communist spies. There was, the Whitaker spy ring. Whitaker Chambers was a spy. It looks like Alger Hiss was a spy. Many of these groups were spies. Now, but people were convinced that it was bigger, that everyone was a spy or anyone could be a spy. And this also meant that if you were part of a group suspected of communist activities, even if it was just like, a slightly left-leaning group like the ACLU, you could lose your job. And the Smith Act, an act passed by Congress, said that it was illegal to teach or advocate for the violent overthrow of the government, and people were jailed for this sort of stuff. Now, many more people, even if they weren't jailed, were brought up in front of what is called HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee. They were forced to answer questions about their political beliefs in front of the senators and congressmen in front of them. Oftentimes, they were asked to name names of people that they knew to be communists, and this was seen often as very much a kangaroo court. You could not prove your innocence, so you were guilty by association. Some people refused to answer, including the Hollywood 10, who were 10 writers and directors and producers from Hollywood who refused to name names. If you did this, it meant that you were in contempt of Congress, which is a punishable offense by prison. Some of them were imprisoned. Other people were blacklisted. That means if you got up in front of HUAC and refused to answer questions, even if you didn't go to prison, companies could just straight up refuse to hire you instead. And that did happen quite a bit. So here are some of the Hollywood 10. Some went to prison, others, in fact, some of the ones who went to prison could not get their scripts passed for years. They actually had to write under false names. Now, people were very worried that the fear of communism was also hurting American freedom. This is the people who were like, communism's bad, but can we get rid of communism by abandoning traditional American freedoms? They compared HUAC to almost like the Nazis. And it wasn't just famous people, too. Regular people were called up in front of HUAC and asked to sign loyalty oaths by their jobs. And if you didn't sign, you could be fired, blacklisted, or just shunned. You could also get in trouble if family members were suspected of communist sympathies as well. So, like, if Bob has a brother, and Bob's not a communist, but his brother is, then Bob could be fired, too, as a security threat. Now, let's look at domestic spy cases. There were, like I said, a few spies found during the Red Scare. This is not a completely, faultless fear that we're having during this time. This did, however, scare people even more. One spy was Alger Hiss. He was part of the Whitaker Chambers spy ring. He was a former New Dealer under FDR, and he was sentenced to 5 years for lying in front of HUAC because they could not prove that he was a spy. Later on, they did find out that he probably actually was a spy. But he got 5 years for lying, spent 3 years in prison. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a husband and wife and part of a spy ring that was at Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico. They worked on the atomic bomb, and they sent They were part of a group that sent secrets to Russia that helped them get nuclear weapons earlier than expected. And they both ended up being found guilty of espionage, and that is a crime punishable by death, and they both died in the electric chair. Now, here's Alger Hist, 1904 to 96, a former lawyer and State Department employee during the Roosevelt administration. He was found not guilty of espionage, found not guilty of spying, but he was convicted of lying under oath, called perjury. Ended up spending 3 years in prison. It was later shown through decrypted intelligence that he, in fact, probably was a Soviet spy. Now, he once said 3 years in prison is as good as corrective for 3 years at Harvard. And here are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, part of a spy ring at Los Alamos, though we don't know how much both of them were part of it. It's been debated. One of the reasons they were put on trial was the hope that they would name names. Both ended up electrocuted in the electric chair, and they are the only spies that we've ever seen executed by the United States during peace times. Now, let's look at McCarthyism. As the fear of communism spread, one person who some people say took advantage of it was the senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy. He encouraged it, definitely, and some people say he even exploited it. He gave a speech in the early 50s where he said that he had the names on a piece of paper that he kind of waved around, the names of hundreds of communists working in the State Department, even though he never showed those names. But he started calling hundreds of people up in front of HUAC and accused them of a vast communist conspiracy, not getting a whole lot of results, but getting a whole lot of people scared and fired and blacklisted and so on and so forth. So here's Joe McCarthy, 1908 to 1957. He's from Wisconsin, where he was a judge, senator, and chair of the Government Operations Committee of the Senate, which is basically the Senate version of HUAC. He also served in the Marine Corps during World War II, although he was accused by some of falsifying or exaggerating what he did during the war. Now, most of these accusations were made without proof, and McCarthy was known to be a bit of a bullier and bullied the accused. Many of them were not communists, but just people that he disagreed with politically or disliked, liberals, Democrats, intellectuals. This tactic of accusing without proof and reckless treatment and bullying of witnesses became known as McCarthyism. And oftentimes, if he was caught lying about something, which he did sometimes, he would exaggerate, sometimes outright lie. He would ignore it and lie again. And this was sort of his tactic of not getting caught in a lie. I heard a quote once saying that, it was hard to catch him in a lie because he would lie 3 times more after that first one. And so it was hard to keep up with him, basically. However, he was also very popular in certain sections of America, seen as sort of like doing God's work and keeping communism at bay here in the United States. Now, here's the first term of McCarthyism. You can see that it's not a positive term. The elephant of the Republican Party saying, "You mean I'm supposed to stand on this wobbly thing with McCarthyism right at the top?" This was done by a cartoonist named Herb Block, better known as Herblock. He tended to put his name together, one of the preeminent political cartoonists of the 1950s. Now, eventually, McCarthy tested the limits a little too far. He went after the Army. The Army didn't like that, and so they went after McCarthy. And these Army McCarthy hearings were televised. And a lot of Americans were very shocked by McCarthy's, they'd seen maybe a 2-minute clip of him on the news, but that's very different from seeing him for hours. And the way that he treated people, the fact that he occasionally drank a little bit during these trials. The Senate very quickly after this, eventually the Army McCarthy hearings kind of came to nothing, but they said, "We are not going to talk to you anymore," basically. The Senate censured McCarthy, basically expressed their disapproval and said, "You've done wrong." He died a few years later, most people believe, of alcoholism. However, the term McCarthyism still lives on as a shorthand for accusing people without proof. So here's Joe McCarthy and the head lawyer for the Army, Joe Welch, having a debate during the Army McCarthy hearings. Welch really looks like he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the world at that moment. And here is an example of how McCarthyism lived on in metaphor. Arthur Miller's The Crucible is the story of the Salem witch trials, but it's actually a story of the communist witch hunts going on during the McCarthy era. And this is what we call an allegory. And it's an allegory that I believe you all read as part of your first semester in American Lit.